I'm Larry Ray, President and CEO of American Manganese Inc., listed on the TSX Venture, ticker symbol AMY, A-M-Y, with proprietary patents in the U.S., China, and South Africa. Our focus is on recycling lithium-ion batteries for electric vehicles. China recently legislated the responsibility for recycling onto their electric vehicle manufacturers and importers. For more information, please visit AmericanManganeseInc.com or phone me, Larry Ray, at 778-574-4444.
You're listening to HowStreet.com radio, available online at TalkDigitalNetwork.com. Welcome to HowStreet.com radio, the online source for market opinions. Here is Jim Goddard.
My guest is James Corbett, publisher of thecorbettreport.com and editorial writer for the International Forecaster. He's speaking to us from Japan, where he's worked and lived since 2004. Welcome to the show, James.
Well, thank you for having me back on. Always a pleasure to be here.
History made. The heads of Taiwan and China held their first face-to-face meeting since 1948. Is that going to help tensions be relieved or released between these two nations? Or, who, as China says, one nation?
Yes. Right, exactly. Well, that's the key issue, isn't it? And that's exactly why there hasn't been a historic handshake for 60-plus years, and why this is a pretty momentous occasion. But I think it's not going to calm tensions any, because specifically this comes in the context of a Taiwanese election, in which this handshake is more or less an endorsement of sorts by President Xi Jinping of the incumbent Taiwanese President Ma Jing-yung, who is, of course, the head of the pro-unification, or at least not anti-unification, Kuomintang, who, of course, were the opponents of the Communist Chinese Party that were kicked off and which started the entire Taiwan-Chinese rift. But in this current election cycle, the current president and his party is more or less committed to at least the status quo with China, whereas his opponents, the Democratic Progressive Party, are more interested in independence for Taiwan and would push more strongly for that. So really, this is President Xi's way of coming in and saying, well, China would like to work with the incumbent party, and so vote for him in the election. And I think that if anything, that will only polarize the issue in Taiwan rather than water. This might be gasoline to a fire, because of course this is one of the central issues of Taiwanese politics, and continues to be so, and will continue to be so as long as the battle over the Straits of Taiwan, as it were, continues to not rage on, but continues to be the kind of Cold War that it's been for the last 60 years.
Are people allowed to travel between mainland China and Taiwan?
There is travel, but I'm sure there are restrictions. I don't know the details of those restrictions. There is travel and trade of some sort, but there's obviously tension there, and it's, as I say, it's a status quo that has been maintained for quite a while now. And the traditional assumption of the security arrangement is that if there is any disruption of that status quo, the U.S. is militarily obliged to intervene. So that's been the kind of checkmate. But I think that although that has been envisioned as the potential scenario for some sort of military confrontation with China, and has been the thing that has been wargamed and strategized for decades now, I think that is starting to change. And there is the assumption that the status quo could change between China and Taiwan. And I think that's why this upcoming election might be important in that sense, that there is a sense that Taiwan and China may be coming to some sort of newer arrangement, especially now that the TPP is about to kick into effect, of course, trying to oust China even further from the sphere of influence of America and its proxies in the Asia-Pacific region.
What has been the reaction to the TPP so far?
I think the reaction so far has been, the text has finally been released, but for anyone who has tried to read through it, and I have started my way through it, I am going to read my way through it and see what I can find. But the legalese, of course, is always confusing. So one is usually left to at the whim of the people who are putting this text together. So, for example, the U.S. Trade Representative has it up on their website, along with a handy running commentary about why this is good for America. And I can't remember the rhetoric on the USTR website, but it's something like TPP made in America for Americans, or something of that sort, which is, I mean, kind of a laughable way of framing it, but one understands how they're trying to frame that narrative. But unfortunately, from everything that I've seen so far, the worst fears about the TPP have been confirmed by the text so far, and the way that people are reading into it, basically this is the abrogation of longstanding norms in a lot of countries around such things as intellectual property and other very key and sensitive issues for things like getting generic, affordable medicine to people in developing countries, and that has been undermined by this TPP text. So, again, it depends on what side of the aisle you're coming from, and I suppose there are certain multinational corporations that are very excited about this, but I think the public has a lot of reasons to be wary.
Should Prime Minister Trudeau go through it with a fine-tooth comb before approving it?
Well, certainly if he is committed to actually being a steward of the public trust, I think that's the bare minimum of what would be necessary in this case. I have the sense that it would be very surprising if this text was actually rejected, because Canada really only has the option of ratifying it or not ratifying it. I don't think there's any real chance for amendment at this point. So I would find it very surprising if Canada ultimately ends to opt into this treaty, but certainly the bare minimum responsibility that Trudeau would have to fulfill his mandate that he was given in the election would be to very carefully scrutinize this deal that was, of course, negotiated under the Harper government.
Does it truly take away the rights of nations to pass laws that control environmental things, medical regulations, and so on, especially if those controls potentially could harm the profits of a company?
It doesn't take away that right per se, but it certainly does give to corporations a mechanism for suing governments that do things that counteract their profits. And that could potentially be used, for example, by multinational seed conglomerates like Monsanto or others who sell genetically modified seeds to sue countries that attempt to pass even so much as labeling laws for GM products. That could potentially be the type of thing that would be arbitrated by this new mechanism created by the TPP, where the company could argue that because you are passing this law, it will cut into our profits, so we can sue you for those lost profits. It doesn't mean that a country can't ultimately pass labeling laws or anything of the sort. It just means that the corporations would have a reason and access to sue those governments for doing so.
Could you pass a law saying our courts don't have to recognize this?
Not if you wanted to be a member of the treaty in good standing, at any rate. And I'm not sure what the ultimate arbitration authority on that issue would be, but one assumes that the governments that are signing up to be a member of this partnership are thereby explicitly signing up to the adjudication by this court mechanism that's set up by the treaty.
Well, from what I understand, the adjudicators are three corporate lawyers who, after they rule one way or another, could always resign from the tribunal and go to work for the company whose case they had just judged.
As can the politicians who are currently going to sign this deal
exactly
into existence. Yeah.
Yes, our Foreign Affairs Minister James Baird, who resigned, is now on the board of Barrick Gold, the biggest gold company in the world. Don't know if there was any influence going on there. The UN Global Change Conference is coming up in Paris. How important is that to people in Japan and Asia?
Extremely important, because, of course, this is an attempt to come up with a new climate treaty to replace the Kyoto Treaty, of course named after Kyoto, Japan, where the previous treaty was put into effect. And this is another treaty coming out from the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which is more than a mouthful. This is their Conference of the Parties, the 21st edition that's coming up in Paris at the end of this month and stretching into December. And the draft treaty of the text that they're working on has been released. And people who have been looking through it have found some very worrying language in there about a coming climate tribunal that is apparently being at least talked about in this draft treaty, that would have the power to adjudicate on whether or not countries that members that sign up to this treaty are sufficiently working to meet their carbon reduction goals. And although this treaty, this draft text talks about having a non-adversarial, non-judicial way of enforcing the judgments of this climate tribunal, one wonders what that even means, to have a non-adversarial, non-judicial way of enforcing a judgment of an international body of law. I mean, it's almost contradictory in terms. So I think there's going to be a lot of change and amendment and hammering down of details that will come in the negotiation of this treaty, but it's certainly is a major mechanism that's being proposed, and it's just one of the many things that are being proposed as potential outcomes of this conference, which will not only affect, I think, Asia. Certainly, China is going to be a major player at this round of negotiations, but I think the world in general, and Americans and Canadians as well.
Well, a treaty that isn't actively supported by China, India, and the U.S. is basically meaningless, considering they're the biggest polluters in the world.
That is true. And although China has apparently shown more interest in being involved in these types of agreements, as they recently concluded some sort of climate agreement with the United States, but as people are noting now, it may be a situation where they're just trying to look good on paper, look good in terms of what the international community is expecting, and will continue to act on their own, as I believe they've already approved something like 155 new coal-fired power plants for China in the upcoming years with their new 5-year plan. So they continue to engage in the same practices, but it seems like they want more of a table at the international at some of these international bodies like the IMF and others. And I think in order to do that, they're at least giving lip service to this climate change agenda. So it will be interesting to see what they actually agree to and sign on to at the UN.
Well, is it true it was either the Chinese premier or president, when they were visiting Africa, they loaded their plane with as much ivory as they could?
I didn't hear about that, but it would not surprise me. I think that the relationship between China and Africa is very explicitly one of, a business relationship, but it's certainly about trying to acquire as many resources as possible and as many products as possible. And I don't think China really cares about bans on ivory trade or things of that sort. I think that in the same way they don't really care about working with any government in Africa to acquire whatever resources they want.
Getting back to the environment, perhaps one of the biggest environmental disasters happening in the world right now is a giant forest fire in Indonesia that I haven't heard about until now. Can you tell us about it?
Well, not only yourself, but I think not many people at all have heard about the Indonesian forest fire, and it is continuing to rage. It is mind-boggling in its size, and the last estimate that I saw of the amount of area that was up in flames right now is 5,000 square kilometers, nearly 3,100 square miles of land on fire, and collectively producing, incidentally, more emissions than the entire U.S. economy on a daily basis. This is, just mind-boggling scope. And yet, it's not really being covered at all in the mainstream media. At least not that shows up on the front pages of any of the newspapers. And I think this might be related to the fact that the out of control fires, although there are a lot of, this is an annual process basically for Indonesia. This particular fire is out of control right now, and I think it all goes back to some of the deforestation practices of the palm oil industry, which goes back to a lot of major corporations and their farming practices in Indonesia, and that's Nestle and Starbucks and PepsiCo and Heinz and others who have been implicated in these deforestry practices, including, of course, burning controlled burns, quote unquote, of the land that often get out of control, but not quite so much as this. So again, there's a lot of, this is just a huge, huge problem for Indonesia and increasingly other parts of the globe. And people can find out more about this if they actually search specifically for this information. But other than that, it's not getting a lot of mainstream attention.
Is this a case of it doesn't affect white English-speaking people, so we don't care?
It could very well be that phenomenon. At any rate, it certainly is something that is being swept under the rug, and it's interesting to speculate on why that is. And perhaps it just doesn't quite mesh with the run up to the Conference of the Parties in Paris, where of course it's all about evil SUVs or whatever are threatening the planet. It's not such things as forest fires.
Slash and burn agriculture. We'll have more with James Corbett right after the break.
I'm Larry Ray, President and CEO of American Manganese Inc., listed on the TSX Venture, ticker symbol AMY, A-M-Y, with proprietary patents in the U.S., China, and South Africa. Our focus is on recycling lithium-ion batteries for electric vehicles. China recently legislated the responsibility for recycling onto their electric vehicle manufacturers and importers. For more information, please visit AmericanManganeseInc.com or phone me, Larry Ray, at 778-574-4444.
More and more people are looking to the internet for intelligent, riveting, and thought-provoking interviews. To advertise on the Goddard Report and TalkDigitalNetwork.com, call 604-699-8600, 604-699-8600.
Welcome back. We're speaking with James Corbett. The Canadian government wants to live up to its promise to bring 25,000 Syrian refugees to Canada by the new year. Is that possible for Canada to jam that many people into the country that fast, or will it just lead to a lot of problems that may discourage further migrants to settle here?
Well, is it physically possible? Yes, I'm sure. But will it be politically feasible? Will it actually be able to be pulled off? Let alone will these people be able to integrate into Canadian society? That, of course, is a very large question mark, and one that isn't at all clear at this point. I think that this is something that, this is something that the European experience in recent weeks and months will I think, inform our understanding of what's likely to transpire in Canada with this. And I think it's a pretty bold move for a brand new government to attempt to do something like this so soon, and perhaps a chance to try to create some sort of bold new direction for the new government. But I don't think that this is something that seems to have been planned out very well, and I don't think there's a lot of the political, let alone the economic infrastructure to deal with this type of influx.
My only question is, it's a good idea to have immigrants come to the country, 25,000 for sure, but by putting an artificial time limit on it, it has to be done by New Year's. I could just see so many problems cropping up, whereas if you said, well, we're starting to do it and our plan is to get these people in within a few months. But, it's like those reality shows where they put artificial deadlines on stuff. We can't get the shipment of new widgets in. If we don't make it by 3:00 tomorrow, we'll lose our contract. This isn't a case of that. I don't think the Syrian refugees, I got into Canada 3 days after New Year's, you didn't meet your promise, would complain.
Well, that's a very good point, and I think it speaks to the political expediency of this. Again, I think this is more of a political decision than it is necessarily one that has these refugees' best interests in mind, let alone what Canada can actually feasibly bring about. So it is seen as to be dramatic action, and I think that's the sort of reaction that's being looked for, and that's why there are these types of arbitrary numbers and deadlines that are bureaucratically being slotted into place right now, rather than anything that reflects the actual abilities of Canada to accept it and absorb this kind of influx.
Well, they said they'll be staying, many of them, at armed forces bases, and I thought, if you're putting them in tents, do they realize what Canada's like in January and February? It's not the nicest climate to settle down in artificial or flappy accommodation.
And that might be the next political scandal coming down the line, for which I'm sure there will be a stock political solution. Again, I think that this is, like so many other things, this is about the flexing of the central planning muscle, as it were, of the government, rather than a genuine attempt to help these people out.
The downing of that Russian airliner in Egypt, there's little doubt, I think, that something brought it down, a bomb or a missile, and I think they're favoring bomb. Do we know who might have planted it and why?
Well, I will back you up on that. I think the debris field was spread out over something like 9 kilometers, so clearly the plane broke apart in midair, and generally speaking, planes do not just fall apart in midair. It was most likely the result of an explosion, and it was high enough that it was almost certainly not brought down with any kind of surface-to-air type of weapon. So it was most likely brought down with a bomb. But again, I don't think we have any access to the investigation inner workings or what they're ultimately finding. So anything is really speculation at this point. All we know is that, of course, Russia has become militarily engaged in Syria quite spectacularly over the course of the past couple of months, and that provides a reason, at least on the surface level, it certainly does provide a reason for ISIS or the Islamic State to try to retaliate against Russia. But perhaps more interestingly, it it presents a reason for those who have been backing the Islamic State and funding and training and arming and supplying them since the inception of this Syrian quote-unquote civil war to retaliate at Russia, by which I mean specifically the Gulf states, Turkey, the United States, others who have been supplying and funding the so-called moderate opposition, and wouldn't you know it, all of this is getting in the hands of the Islamic State. And I think with the giant black eye that the U.S. and others have been receiving as Russia moves in to actually start doing something decisive on the ground in Syria, it certainly does create an environment where I don't think the United States or its allies would particularly mind to see this type of action happening against Russia. On the other side of that equation, the Russian government is, of course, bolstered by this ultimately because it serves in the exact same way as a 9/11 or whatever other type of event we can think of in recent years to rally public opinion around the government. Well, clearly, we have to stand against the terrorists, so it will only embolden, I think, the public opinion in Russia to if not continue, at least, or if not at least continue, then perhaps to increase military involvement in Syria.
And Russia in the past has not been beyond bombing its own citizens to increase their popularity for fighting wars, say against the republics in Russia who want to break away.
That's exactly right. And for people who don't know, they should look into the Moscow apartment bombings and the fact that the FSB, the Russian equivalent of the CIA/FBI, were found with test explosives, were actually caught planting what they called test explosives at the scene of apartments while this bombing spree was taking place, and that information was quickly swept under the rug. So unfortunately, this is something we see time and time again throughout history, and country after country. Governments always tend to benefit from these types of national tragedies that can then be used to forward an agenda, and I think that's something that shouldn't be ruled out here.
Sure. I mean, the Reichstag fire in Berlin, Hitler blamed on the Jews.
The communists, and yes, they rounded up Marinus van der Lubbe, who was basically a mentally challenged individual who could probably not tie his own shoelaces, but was basically supposedly the mastermind behind that. And again, a lot of information to suggest that was not the actual way that those events unfolded, but certainly the Nazi government capitalized on that by forwarding their own political agenda and centralizing control. So again, it happens time and time again throughout history.
We have China building their artificial islands or enhancing them in the South China Sea, Russia in Syria, the U.S. trying to be everywhere at once, as I call them, world police. What is the state of relations between those three nations, or does it depend what level at what time of day?
Yes, I think so. And yes, what level? I mean, I think there are different interests here that have different, that have their own ends that they're aiming for. And I think in each side, in each case, it is a case-by-case basis. Will an alliance or at least a cooling off of tension help us in the furthering of this goal for this particular end? I think it really does vary from day to day. But generally speaking, I mean, we are seeing what I think is the painting of the broad narrative for the coming decades, which is the U.S.-NATO alliance versus some sort of resistance bloc that includes China and Russia and Iran as some of the most notable targets of that. And I think that's the way that this is being set up. And of course, we see those types of tensions playing out in places like the South China Sea. But it's not always quite that simplistic. And for example, I mean, just as one example, I think the China-Russia relationship is an interesting one because although they are certainly coming together and cooperating quite a bit more and starting gas deals and things of that sort, but there's still tensions there. There's still something of an implicit tension between, for example, Moscow's creation of the Eurasian Economic Union and China's Silk Road and Silk Belt, or I can't remember what they're calling it, Silk Road and Belt strategy to try to create a trading bloc that moves through the Central Asian region. I think those are competing interests. So we see that China and Russia, sometimes their interests converge, sometimes they collide. U.S. and China obviously have a trading relationship that is extremely important to both nations' economies, but you see things like the TPP or the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank that seem to be at odds with each other. So I think there are tensions and points of accord. And I think it really is more on a case-by-case basis, and depending on what the strategy of the day is.
How is the Baltic Dry Index doing? And for people who don't know, it measures the amount of shipping and goods that goes around the planet, right?
It does, and I do not have the latest numbers, actually. I don't know where it's standing at now. I do know that it has been declining for some time and reaching some very worryingly low levels, which is worrying because it is a very good hard indicator of global trade and where things are going. And just glancing right now, I see that right now it's standing at 599, which is not only downwards, but almost at a 5-year low. We're approaching the 5-year low, which was reached earlier this year. So again, this as an indicator of global trade, it is extremely important because this is one indicator that's very hard to fudge or manipulate or to try to paint in a different way. And when it's on the decline, generally speaking, that means there is a global slowdown in trade. And that looks like what we're seeing, not only obviously from this number, but from a lot of different numbers. And that's worrying for everyone, I think, because clearly global trade has been the driver of global growth for the last several years, if not decades. And I think, when we see that decline, we start to see problems spilling out in the economies of most of the nation.
Well, if Canada's worried about how to bring all those Syrian refugees to Canada, maybe there will be some empty freighters available.
Yes.
It's sad to say.
Unfortunately so. Yes. Certainly trade is on the decline right now, and that's not good for Canada, a heavily trade-dependent nation. And of course, the oil worries are also another thing that Trudeau is going to have to deal with, and very quickly, I think.
Well, I've heard oil prices could stay low for up to 5 years. OPEC said just the other day that, okay, the prices are down, but demand is up, so maybe that'll make up for some of it. Is that a realistic point of view?
Well, I guess, again, it depends how you're situated in that market. But for speaking, I mean, generally for Canada and specifically for the oil companies in Alberta and Calgary, I don't think that that's going to be the case. And one indicator of that is an interesting report that just came out through Bloomberg about the Calgary commercial real estate market, showing vacancies upwards of 14% in downtown Calgary, with something like 3.5 million more square feet of office space coming online in the next few years, and there's already record vacancies. So we're looking at that's just one indicator of the hurt that a lot of companies are feeling right now, and that's going to spread out throughout certainly the Alberta economy, and I think ultimately generally the Canadian economy. And low prices, I mean, it's quite obviously tied. If you look at, for example, Calgary real estate vacancy tied to the oil price, it's almost in lockstep, and I don't think that should be particularly surprising. So continued low oil prices will certainly be hurting the corporations there in Calgary.
What's the likelihood of a bond market crash right now?
That's a good question. I mean, really, ultimately, this depends so much of economic reality does these days on the decisions of the central bankers, specifically, of course, in this case, we're looking at the Federal Reserve. And will they, won't they? Their next chance to hike the interest rate is mid-December. A lot of people are saying they're going to, in order, if nothing else, at least to save face after having promised that, or at least strongly indicated that it would take place this year. This will be their last window of opportunity to do so. So a lot of people are looking for an interest rate hike. But I mean, will that crash the bond market? I mean, certainly people are not looking for yields to rise anytime in the near future, and I don't think there's any positive prospect for bonds. Will it be a crash? That's another question altogether, although we did see that bond flash crash last year, which shows that there is not a lot of liquidity in the markets, and they are extremely volatile. So it's certainly not something that a lot of people are looking to as a long-term investment at this point.
James, thanks a lot for chatting with us.
Thank you very much for having me.
My guest has been James Corbett, publisher of the CorbettReport.com and editorial writer for the International Forecaster. You're listening to HowStreet.com radio. Find us on Twitter at TalkDigitalNet. Our popular YouTube channel is Talk Digital Network. Comments about the show can be sent to info@HowStreet.com. I'm Jim Goddard.
Comments made on HowStreet.com radio are an expression of opinion only and should not be construed in any matter whatsoever as recommendations to buy or sell any financial instrument at any time. Available online at talkdigitalnetwork.com. HowStreet.com Radio is a production of How Street Media Incorporated.